Spiritual Unfoldment. Part 2. Spiritual Unfoldment. The gradual development or revelation of the spiritual. Spiritual retardment. Lack of spiritual unfoldment. For as he hath given, try me, and I will prove myself to thee, in the choice of thine own inner consciousness. These then be the measures, be the sources, be the channels through which the self may gain the greater understanding, find the greater unfoldment, have within thine own self, the greater consciousness that he hath work, he hath a purpose in thy experiences day by day. But as self in any of its experiences is a channel for the expression of the fruits of the spirit of a living animation, a living God, these be growths, these be unfoldments, illuminations in the experiences of the entity. In giving the interpretations of the records as we find here, that which may be helpful and hopeful is chosen with the hope of the application of that given for the awakening or unfoldment of the spiritual self, to become aware of that love that is set through the Christ consciousness into the hearts of men everywhere. For it is ever the now. As in relationship of the soul to the universal consciousness, to the universal love. That makes for the awareness of the unfoldments of the inner self with creative forces or God in the experience. In choosing from the records here for this entity, there is much from which to choose. The activities through the experiences in the earth have not always been what to the entity might be called beautiful, yet ever an unfoldment. One who finds it very hard to work for anyone else. Then, learn, in self, to work with others. This is the greater problem of the entity and one it must meet in self. By keeping its ideals spiritually as well as mentally, but coordinate and collaborate with others. It is not always easy, but will be for the unfoldment of the entity. In giving the interpretations of the records as we find them here, these we choose with a desire and purpose that this may be a helpful experience for the entity. As we find, there might be many courses taken in interpreting the activities especially of the entity through the material sojourns. For, there have been accomplishments, but in quite varied or an assortment of manners. But these we choose, that the purpose for which a soul enters the material plane may be enlarged upon, or as an unfoldment to the entity, that there may be a greater fulfillment in those directions that fulfill this purpose. As to the appearances in the earth, these have been sufficient to give a very well-balanced individual. While quite varied in activities the periods in the earth's unfoldment, these have been contributing periods to the welfare of many groups and of the own associations through trying experiences, and these will be a part of entity's experience in the present sojourn. In these directions we would find the entity making an outlet, then, that may bring material as well as social position or power. In Jupiter comes the balance that is kept in same, that may make for a greater unfoldment or attainment for the entity in the present, this being rather to the universal consciousness, but also that in which the entity may make its own choice in its spiritual relationships with activities to groups and organizations in this present material plane. But they that show in their daily experiences the seeds of the spirit of truth. Patience, long-suffering, gentleness, kindness, even to those that despitefully use them. They may then know that he will walk with them. For man may only sow, God alone may give that increase, that unfoldment, that quickening of the spirit of truth that indeed makes thee free. Free of what? Of the turmoils that arise from disturbing forces that may be manifested in the experiences of a soul as one to another, that seek to glorify or magnify their own selfish desires. Am I very psychic, and should I attempt to develop abilities in this direction? This depends upon the use to which such would be put, or the purpose to which these unfoldments would come. How can the work of the association be spread among the young people of Washington? By presenting same in those various channels and meetings and places where there is sought first a knowledge, an understanding of the enfoldment and unfoldment of truth. Which of my associates should I avoid and which should I cultivate to help me toward my own unfoldment? No associate ever becomes a part of thine experience save as an opportunity for the developing of that thou dost hold as thy ideal. Live thine own life and use each associate, each opportunity as the means for giving expression to that which is thy ideal. And then the fruits of thy activity will. Even as with he. Cement those friendships that may bring the greater blessing in thine own experience, as well as in the experiences of all whom ye contact. There is no such thing as having too many friends, or having so many that you can afford to lose a single one. This does not indicate, to be sure, as from what has just been given that all are within the inner circle, as it were, but rather that ye will lose no opportunity. By mere acquaintance or by passing chance. Of giving the opportunity for such to know what is thy ideal. Cultivate those who bring thee strength in thy ideal, not in thy weaknesses or thy faults. For these ye know within thine own self, as ye meet them day by day. The entity is to use. Or may use that in hand for the greater undertaking, the greater developments in the present, and not in the past. Use the past as the stepping stone for the unfoldment, the awareness, the consciousness of the indwelling of those influences from creative forces from without, that may aid in arousing, awakening in the hearts and minds of those whom the entity may contact, the greater revelation as to their abilities, their purposes, their missions in the material sojourn. Jupiter is the protective influence, and if there is the application of self in the directions indicated. When Jupiter and Venus enter a conjunction through the latter portions of the present year. There should begin an unfoldment for the entity that may become as beautiful as the hearts upon the hills and as the ripple of the many waters. That bring the joy in their life-giving forces, as well as their purging of body and mind for a more beautiful service to him. Before this we find the entity was in the land now known as the Mexican and Yucatan land, during those periods when there were the voices of the peoples in the land, proclaiming that there had come a new revelation to those that had been strangers in a portion of the land. The entity was among the priestesses of the Mayan experience. It was just before that period when those as from the east had come, and there were the beginnings of the unfoldments of the understanding, that there were other portions of the same land, or those that were visiting from other worlds or planets. In giving an aura chart, the records are attempted to be interpreted from the experiences of an entity in the material plane. Indicating in the center the picturization of what is the high point in the unfoldment or awareness of an entity in the period, and indicating by the signs and symbols the manner in which such activities influenced the entity. The central figure would be dressed as the ministering angel to the ill. This would indicate the place and the high point of the entity's unfoldment. There shall be great stress in the unfoldment or development of the entity, upon its trust in divine sources, of its care, of its intent, of its trust in those with whom it becomes active. Not as to daring, but as for purpose, as for hope, as for those forces of the divine nature, that the entity in its intent and purpose may be kept in a sound perfect body, to better fulfill its purpose in the earth in its present sojourn. As to the abilities of the entity in the present, then, these fall into two distinct fields. Administering of law through governmental influences or forces, or that of riding upon special character or nature of subjects. And if the entity will apply self in either of these channels, and the choice must be made as to its own ideals, we may bring not only the material, but the opportunities for the greater unfoldment into mental and spiritual accomplishments. Let thy yeas be yea and thy nays nay. But know in whom as well as in what ye believe. Let thy ideals, though they be material, mental and spiritual, founded upon a spiritual basis. For without same there is no continuity or life. And so live thine own life, and create in the experience and minds of others, that whereunto will develop something that may be carried on into eternity. For only good lives on. Should I take a more active interest in the running of Camp Dunmore for boys and girls, having in mind eventually owning a camp? Or that camp? Such interests will not only be well, but will give an outlet to the entity for the unfoldments in its relationships to its own offspring. This was we find would be well to consider. Not merely as a hobby, but the interests must be because of the very love of the good that may be done for the young, and not merely as a means of recreation for self or the taking advantage of conditions of others. But let the basic principle be for good and for the benefit that the young may obtain, but for the love of it. And then the incomes from same will be more than adequate. We would minimize the faults and magnify the virtues. This should be the ideal and purpose of the entity in its dealings with others, though there may oft occur in the experience the inclination to feel that the entity is being neglected. This is something of the ego manifesting. And yet this used aright and in the Christ consciousness may bring not only a growth and an unfoldment but hope and peace in the lives of others. But if it is applied in a nature as of requiring the attention to self, it may bring hardships, even separations. But remember, it is best to learn first to be able to live with self and thy concept of thy maker. In the present experience, as indicated, there are, to be sure, teachers and seekers. The entity is a seeker. And those things that bespeak of the eternal truths are the channels through which the entity may find the greater outlet for its material, its mental and its spiritual unfoldment. One may grow in one's mental unfoldment. One may arrive in a spiritual consciousness that is ever present for each soul. For, the soul is of God to each entity. And one is no more precious than another, the preciousness being then in the individual. In giving an interpretation of the records as we find them here, these we find are rather unusual. Much that is indicated as the experience of the entity in the material plane, so alters those manifestations of the entity during the interims, that little of the so-called astrological aspects would be in keeping with those applications necessary for the entity to attain that unfoldment or that development in this experience, which would bring the greater development. Would the history of the Jewish race from Abraham to Jesus parallel the development of the embryo from conception to birth? Rather would the history of man from Noah to Abraham, while that from Abraham to Christ would be the mental unfoldment of the body. For, that which leads to the Christ is the mind. And the mind's unfoldment may be that indicated from Abraham to the Christ,